Hello and welcome back for this, our third session in our online retreat, Come and Rest. If you're just joining us now, then there have been 2 previous sessions and you may want to catch up with them on YouTube. The first one, we looked at Philippians 4, 6-8. We thought about what the Apostle Paul says there about the fact that we don't need to worry, we can pray about everything, and we should be thankful. So worry about nothing, pray about everything, and be thankful. Those were the 3 points from session 1. We then had session 2, where we looked at the biblical character of Hannah from 1 Samuel, and Hannah is a character who beautifully illustrates those 3 points for us and beautifully illustrates what it means to enter into a place of rest where we can know the peace of God that passes all understanding, and know that peace guarding our hearts and guarding our minds. So if you missed that, then do go back and you can catch up there. You will also see notes for those 2 sessions in your workbook. And again, if you don't have a copy of the workbook, you can get that either by going on my blog, the address of which is on YouTube, or going emailing me, and I will send you a copy of the workbook. It will help you to follow what we're doing in these sessions. It will also give you some resources for your private reflective times. So this third session is going to be more reflective, but before we get into it, in an effort to get into the posture of our body and of our soul, where we are quietening ourselves, I invite you, as I have done before, to hold your palms out in front of you and simply relax. Simply breathe in, breathe out slowly. Do it 3 times. Close your eyes, and the simple prayer on our lips is the prayer of the young boy Samuel in 1 Samuel 3, where he says, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." And as we quieten our bodies and quieten our minds in that posture, I'll play again the music of Jonathan Ray for you, and we will listen to that song.
Yourselves apart and rest a while. Weary, I know it, of the press and throng. Wipe from your brow the sweat and dust of toil, and in my quiet strength again be strong. Come ye aside from all the world holds dear, for converse which the world has never known, alone with me and with my Father here, with me and with my Father, not alone. Come, tell me all that you have said and done, your victories and failures, hopes and fears. I know how hardly souls are wooed and won. My choicest wreaths are eyes wet with tears. Come ye and rest, the journey is too great, and ye will faint beside the way and sink. The bread of life is here for you to eat, and here for you the wine of love to drink. Then fresh from converse with your Lord return, and work till daylight softens into eve. The brief hours are not lost in which ye learn more of your Master and his rest in heaven.
So, as we begin this third session, I invite you to listen while I read an article to you from Richard Foster. It's an article about coming home. And I think that the whole concept of coming home is something that is very akin to the concept of coming into the rest that God has for us. I think there's something within all of us that is yearning for home. And you may identify with that, you may not, but as we read this article, as we reflect on it, I encourage you to listen attentively, listen quietly, and let God speak to you as He will. God is inviting you to come home to where we belong, to come home to that for which we were created. His arms are stretched out wide to receive us. His heart is enlarged to take us in. For too long we have been in a far country, a country of noise and hurry and crowds, a country of climb and push and shove, a country of frustration and fear and intimidation. And He welcomes us home, home to serenity and peace and joy, home to friendship and fellowship and openness, home to intimacy and acceptance and affirmation. We do not need to be shy. He invites us into the living room of His heart, where we can put on old slippers and share freely. He invites us into the kitchen of His friendship, where chatter and batter mix in good fun. He invites us into the dining room of His strength, where we can feast to our heart's delight. He invites us into the study of His wisdom, where we can learn and grow and stretch and ask all the questions we want. He invites us into the workshop of His creativity, where we can be co-laborers with Him, working together to determine the outcome of events. He invites us into the bedroom of His rest, where new peace is found, and where we can be naked and vulnerable and free. It is also the place of deepest intimacy, where we know and are known to the fullest. So let's turn now to the Bible, the New Testament, and we're going to look at 3 verses in Matthew 11. The first verse is one that many of you will know, some of you will know by heart, And it says this, "Come to me." This is Jesus speaking. "Come to me, all who labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." The next two verses say, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." So let's just look at those three verses together. First of all, in verse 28, "Come to me, all who labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." So first we want to think, what was the context of this? Why was Jesus suggesting that his listeners were heavy laden and they needed rest? Well, the Jews of the day were taught by very religious leaders, some of them called scribes, some of them called Pharisees, who not only taught the Old Testament scriptures, but sometimes interpreted them in such a way as to add heavy burdens to the people of God. They would demand things that weren't actually required by God. In their zeal, in their anxiety to keep the letter of the law, they would add a heavy burden on the shoulders of the people of God. And Jesus knew that. Jesus understood that. And sometimes Jesus actually rebuked the scribes and Pharisees of his day. Listen to this. He says these words to them in Matthew chapter 23. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides, straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel." Wow, those were hard words from Jesus, but they show that he recognized what was happening in his time. The scribes and Pharisees were telling the Jews that they had to tithe, even herbs, dill and mint and cumin, they had to tithe. And yet Jesus recognized that perhaps the weightier matters of the law, things like justice and mercy and faithfulness, they were ignoring. And so the Jews felt a heavy burden placed on their shoulders. And Jesus is coming to them and saying, "Come to me, come with your heavy burdens, and I will give you rest." So what does this have to say to us today? We are not living in the time of Jesus. We don't listen to scribes and Pharisees. But the wider application of this is for all of us to hear Jesus' invitation to come, because we all have a burden of sin that we need dealt with. And Jesus, of course, came not just to teach the law, not just to enlighten us as to its meaning, not just to be a good example to us, but ultimately to die on the cross for our sins. And by doing so, Jesus took the punishment that should have been ours and opened up the way home, the way back to God, the way to rest, eternal rest for us. And so I don't know if anyone listening today is still battling with a burden of sin, and you want to be rid of that. You want to come to Jesus. You want to give him your burden of sin and exchange that for his gift of rest. There are others of us who are carrying other burdens, and I don't know what your burden is today. You may be burdened in this time of COVID-19. You may be suffering sickness yourself, or a family member or a loved one. You may have lost someone and be working through the painful time of bereavement. You may have other burdens on your mind today, burdens trying to juggle 24/7, being with family members all of the time on lockdown. You may be homeschooling as well as trying to do your own work from home. You may have lost your job and have a burden of unemployment. You may have the burden of loneliness and isolation. I don't know what your burden is today, but I'm guessing that all of us have some kind of burden that we would do well to bring to Jesus today as he invites us to come and he will give us rest. So think for a moment what your burden is today. I think when I hear an invitation to come, I need to know who's giving the invitation. And if it's to come and do something like rest, then I need to know it's safe to come. And it reminds me of perhaps a mum who's teaching her little toddler to walk. And the mum is at one end of the room. You can picture it with me. The toddler is at the other end of the room and the mum is saying, come. Now, why does the toddler start out across the room very wobbly? Why does he have the confidence to do that? I suggest it's because he knows his mum. He knows that if he does wobble and go to fall, she will catch him. Or picture an older child, perhaps a young girl who's learning to swim. And her dad is at the other end of the pool and he's encouraging her to swim to him. He's saying, come. Why does she come? Well, because she knows she can trust her dad, that he will save her if she begins to sink. And I suggest it's the same with us in this passage. We can come confidently to Jesus. We can accept his invitation because we know who he is. And in the next verse, in verse 29, we're told, I am gentle and lowly in heart. That's who Jesus is. So we know when we come to him, he will treat us as a gentleman would. He will never impose. I love that story of the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. You remember after Jesus had risen from the dead, and he came alongside two disciples who were walking along the road, very downcast, very sad, and totally confused, because Jesus, whom they had thought was going to be their Messiah and free them from the oppression of Rome, had died on a cross, a criminal's death, and they couldn't understand it. And they were talking about this to each other as they walked along the road, and Jesus, unknown to them, they didn't know it was Jesus, came alongside. He had risen from the dead, but they didn't know that. He began to talk to them and explain the scriptures to them. And as they walk and talk, they come eventually to their home. And Jesus, the scriptures tell us, made as if he was going to go on further. And they had to invite him in. And when they did invite him in, they sat down at the table, they broke bread with him. In the breaking of bread, they realized it was Jesus. But I love that picture because it gives us a glimpse of who Jesus is. He's gentle. He's lowly. He's humble. He will never impose. He will wait for us to invite him, or he will wait for us to accept his invitation to come. So that's who we're coming to. And then when we do come to him, we take his yoke. Now this sounds a bit contradictory, I know, because we've said we're coming to Jesus, we're laying our burdens down, and he's giving us rest. And now we're taking his yoke on us. You may know that in the times of Jesus, oxen ploughed the fields, often in pairs, often an older animal with a younger animal, with what was called a yoke across their necks, across the necks of the two animals. And so in that way, the older animal was able to teach the younger animal and to keep the younger animal in step with him, so that as they ploughed the field together, the younger one was learning from the older one. And so that was the yoke that was across the necks of the two animals. So Jesus is saying, come to me and rest and take my yoke upon you. So let's see what it says about his yoke. In verse 30, it says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. In other words, the yoke that Jesus has for us is especially prepared for us. It's made to fit. It's easy. It's light. And it teaches us to walk in rhythm with Jesus. It teaches us to walk in step with him because we're learning from Jesus. We are his disciples and he wants to teach us, and as he does, we will learn from him. I love what these verses sound like in the Message. Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me. Come away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. So he invites you now, come to me, and I will give you rest. We're going to pause and reflect just for a couple of minutes. And as we do that, I'm going to read that verse to you again, Matthew 11:28. And as I read it, I'm just encouraging you to think, what is it you think when these verses are read to you? When this verse is read to you, what are you thinking? How are you feeling? What is your response? Your heart response? Your soul response to these words of Jesus? So I invite you to close your eyes and listen as if Jesus is saying these words to you. Come to me, all who labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And the next verse is, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Now we're going to pause the video. I encourage you to spend about 15 minutes more if you want, and you may want to use the questions that are in your workbook. You may want to use some of the resources that are there. The article that I read at the beginning of this session from Richard Foster is there in full. You may want to read that. Spend this time with Jesus, thinking about what his rest looks like in your life today, and then come back for an announcement about the next session and for a final prayer. Welcome back. We are just going to close now. I will pray for you, and before we do that, I just want to say, if you haven't got the workbook, let me know and I will send it to you. And the final session, number 4, we're going to look at a very short psalm from the Bible, Psalm 131, which is one of my favourite psalms, just 3 verses, but in it we have a beautiful picture of what this rest looks like. And it will be a fitting way to conclude our retreat together. So let me just pray for you before we go. Lord Jesus, we hear your sweet invitation to come to you and rest. We're sorry for the frantic pace of our lives, which often blocks you out. We're sorry that we act as if we don't need you, while all the time our hearts are longing. Longing for you, longing for rest, longing for home. Teach us what it means to enter into your rest. Amen. Thank you.